This is the secondary track, and you can use this link or the other one to flip back and forth between the sessions. During the session, listeners will be able to use the Q&A feature and ask your host any questions. Please follow up with the National Agriculture in the Classroom program later next week when we send you an evaluation. Your feedback is very important to us in providing the next steps in our ag literacy outreach efforts. So without further ado, I'm here to introduce Ms. Carrie from Minnesota Agriculture in the Classroom, and she is going to introduce you to Exploring the Orchard Apple Genetics. Over to you, Carrie.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm sharing my screen. I'm just making sure, Michelle, you're seeing the PowerPoint slides here.
Yep, you're good.
Great. Okay, so we're going to be exploring the orchard today, learning more about apple genetics. My name is Carrie Seidel. A few things I am not. I'm not an apple grower. I'm not an apple breeder. I'm a girl from Florida who moved to Minnesota and has found apples to be a fascinating area of agriculture. And so I'm going to be sharing with you some of the things I've learned, as well as 2 lessons that you could use with middle or high school students around apples. So I just want to start that off. Not an apple breeder, not an apple grower. I will do my best to answer questions, but I'm just an apple enthusiast. So we're going to go ahead and get started. You can see on this screen here some apples. I moved to Minnesota 10 years ago, and while we have oranges in Florida, there was just something about apples growing on a tree that I still find so exciting. And for those of you that might be from Washington, New York, Michigan, that might sound silly to you, but it was just very, very exciting. So we've really become apple orchard enthusiasts. We go every year. I have gotten to try all sorts of apples now. I thought I hated apples growing up because my parents only bought the Red Delicious, and I can't see all of you, but maybe some of you've had that same experience where Red Delicious was the only apple you had tried, and those were not very delicious. So we're going to look here today at apple genetics, exploring the orchard, and I'm going to find, there it is, the spot where I can move on. Okay, the first thing I want all of us to do, and since I can't see you and I can't put you into a group, I want you to take either a piece of paper or your phone, and I want to see if you can list out 10 apple varieties that you think would be the highest, or the top 10. So we're basing that on value of sales in supermarkets, so across the US. Giving you a couple clarifying details there. Take a moment, give you about 60 seconds, and list out the top 10 apple varieties in the US. I should have set a timer. I feel like we might be close to 60 seconds, but I might be a little fast there. In the chat, can you share how many apple varieties you were able to come up with? A number. Was it 5? Was it 7? Let's see.
So Ms. Carrie, they have to use the Q&A to respond.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I did know that. The Q&A, please, not the chat.
You're
I have the
good.
Q&A open. Thank you, Michelle. So I've got one person who came up with 7. Thank you, Leslie, for sharing. 6, 5, 8. Okay, you guys are doing, this is pretty average on what we've seen in all the times I've done this activity. 7. Okay, let's see if the ones that are in fact the top 10 are what you came up with on your list. And since we're all teachers, I'm giving you the source of my data, Nielsen supermarket sales data. This is in no particular order, but here are going to be our top 10 apples. The Gala, Envy, Fuji, Granny Smith, Ambrosia, Honeycrisp, Cosmic Crisp, Red Delicious, Macintosh, Pink Lady. All right, in the Q&A, any of these are a surprise? If you got 7, how many of those did you actually get that were on my list? Let's see what you guys think in the chat. Any of these that were surprising, or share how many you got right in the Q&A. Okay, Leslie, you got 5. Robin, yeah, the envy or the ambrosia. I had not tried the ambrosia, but in Utah, I found it and we tried it. It was okay. It was really sweet. Bonnie got 4, 6, 5. Got 3. Joanne is surprised by Cosmic Crisp. Me too. Done some more research into it. The Washington State apple, and it naturally doesn't brown as fast when you cut into it. So that's a selling feature for that Cosmic Crisp. This is about normal. 5 or 6. There's a lot of different apple varieties, and especially if you live in an apple area, you may not get some of these because you've got other more regional varieties that you like. So we're looking at all these different apple varieties. We're not going to think, pair, share because you are at home. In the Q&A, can you share with me what's your favorite apple variety and why do you prefer that one? What's your favorite apple? Why do you prefer that one? If you can share that in the Q&A here. Ooh, and Bonnie, you should try the Pink Lady. Those were pretty good too. So I'll wait for a few here in the Q&A. Your favorite apple and why you prefer that one. Honeycrisp for taste and texture. Oh, we have a Red Delicious lover. That's great because it's sweet. Cosmic Crisp, it's sweet. The Gala is easy to find. Honeycrisp for its crisp. The Fuji for its flavor and texture. We have a Granny Smith lover. The crisp tart, good with caramel dip. That is a good way to eat apples. Honeycrisp for tart and delicious. Oh, Lydia, you like the ambrosia. They're nice and sweet. They do have a fun name. Reading through. Oh, Julie, Kate, you like the jazz. You're going to like this lesson that's coming up. We're going to talk about the jazz apple. Okay, we've got a couple of Red Delicious lovers. I'm happy that you have an apple that you love. It's just not my favorite. So I had you think about your favorite, why you prefer it, because those are going to be all traits that are making that perfect apple. And that's what our apple breeders today are trying to do, is create that perfect apple, or create perfect apples for different people that have different traits that they're really going to like. And make them purchase that. This is an activity, an engage activity for the lesson we're going to look at. And before we jump into that lesson, there's a video that I just love that I really think gives us a full background into apple breeding, would pique an interest if you're a teenager. It's kind of silly. It's a reenactment of apple breeding and the Honeycrisp apple. So we're going to watch that video. It's about 5 minutes. I am 90% sure that I have shared my screen correctly so that you will have sound and audio. But Michelle, if you are not seeing it properly, would you please let me know and I will reshare my screen to try that. Okay. Here's going to be our video. And I'll show you where to find this as well at the end.
The Miracle Apple by Planet Money. Prologue, The Tyrant. Once upon a time, the apple section in grocery stores was ruled by a tyrant. Tough-skinned, mealy and character-building, it was the Red Delicious. And it was red, but really not so delicious. This is the story of how one man and his miracle apple changed the world of fruit forever. In the old days, like the 1960s, apples were a commodity, like screws or cheap socks. Most big stores just wanted a couple of apples, and especially the Red Delicious, because it was big, it was red, and it had a tough skin that made it easy to transport. People figured an apple's an apple. There was no reason to pay more for one than another. As a result, there was no way for apple growers to make a better apple and charge more for it. It was a bad business to be in. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Hated Apples. In those days, there was a young boy in North Carolina named David Bedford. He didn't know it at the time, but he was destined to change the world of apples forever. Young Bedford loved fruit, but he hated apples, because remember, the tyranny of the Red Delicious. But when he grew up and went off to college, he met this person who was carrying around a bushel of yellow apples from an exotic and mysterious land called Michigan. And this person said, "Try these, man. They'll change your whole world." Bedford took a bite and he saw the truth. He knew the world of apples had to change, and he would be the one to change it. Chapter 2, The Man and the Miracle Apple. It's the 1980s, and Bedford's quest to topple the Red Delicious has led him to become an apple breeder at the University of Minnesota. His is a hard, solitary toil. In the peak of the season, he's taking bites from 500 or 600 apples a day, looking for that one perfect apple. Finally, one day in the early 1980s, he comes across this tree number 1711. He picks an apple from it, takes a bite, and it tasted crisp and honeyed. So he called it
Honeycrisp.
But it didn't catch on at first, because it was harder to grow and because grocery stores were still pretty unimaginative places. They looked at Bedford's apple and said, "Meh, no thanks, the produce aisle's fine." And so the apple growers said, "Yeah, we're fine too." Chapter 3, An Unlikely Alliance. There was one apple grower named Dennis Courtier, though. Around this time, he visits Bedford and says, "I'm not getting anywhere growing the same apples as everybody else. Got anything different?" Bedford does. Courtier tries an apple from tree 1711 and says, "Sweet Iden, this is the apple I've been waiting for." He goes all in, planting Honeycrisp. When these apples finally get to the big supermarkets, they do great. The Honeycrisp proves consumers are willing to pay more for a better apple. It finally breaks the apple free from the commodity world. At long last, Courtier's making good money. But now everyone wants to grow Honeycrisp, and Courtier knows soon it'll just be another one of those cheap generic apples. Meanwhile, Bedford's worried that low-quality Honeycrisps will start to flood the market and make the apple's good name worthless. Chapter 4, Trademarks, or The Fall of Red the Tyrant. Bedford had patented the Honeycrisp, but the thing with patents is they expire after 20 years, and in a business where trees take 5 years to grow, that's not going to cut it. But he knew of an Australian apple company that was doing something radical.
G'day, mate.
Morning, Isaac. What's on the docket today?
Well, let's have a look.
They had actually trademarked an apple name, and trademarks last forever.
Just trademarking this apple, mate.
Ah, beauty, mate. Beauty.
A few of these trademarked foreign apples had actually started showing up in the US. So he decided to see if he could make that work with a US-grown apple. He could. He hadn't quite gotten it right for Honeycrisp, but he did with the next apple, Sweet Tango. He licensed it to Courtier. Now, even if someone else grew the same apple, they couldn't use the same name. If you own the trademark, you decide who can grow or sell your apple. You manage the market. The world of different apple brands exploded around the Red Delicious. Envy, Cosmic Crisp, Jazz, Kanzi, Lady Alice, Ruby Frost, Snapdragon, Pink Lady. So when you're in a store today, you're not just looking at a bunch of apples. You are looking at the legacy of the miracle apple, the freedom from the commodity world, and the big business of a small fruit, grown in part from that moment Bedford tasted that sweet, crisp apple on tree 1711 in 1983. The end.
All right, so that video really, I think, is just a funny way to give us a reason why we would care about apple genetics or be thinking about all the different apples that we see at the grocery store. The point of this part of the presentation is giving you a little bit of background information so that you're ready to teach the apple genetics lesson with your students and you've already got to learn a few things. So I'm in Minnesota. I think you probably made the connection. The Honeycrisp was developed at the University of Minnesota at the Horticulture Research Center. That's just 20 or so minutes down the road from where I live. I took some students on a field trip and got to see the Honeycrisp tree and meet David Bedford, who is the plant breeder or the apple breeder that this video was all about. So we're gonna keep moving here and get into the actual lesson, what that looks like with your students. I think though, because yes, this is just a little bonus slide for you. It's not part of the lesson. It's just to pique your curiosity in case you think apples are as interesting as I do. So we saw in that video all the different kinds of apple varieties that have exploded since the Honeycrisp. So the Honeycrisp made it so that you weren't just selling an apple as a commodity. An apple wasn't just an apple. Now we have all these different varieties. And all these apple breeders at various places in the US, there's 3 big ones. Cornell University, so anyone from New York that's near you, Washington State, and the University of Minnesota are really the big apple breeders. They're always looking for that next great apple. Whether it's easier to grow, it's going to ripen sooner, it's going to have the crisp and the tart, maybe it doesn't brown. Think of all the things that you would like in an apple, and they're always trying to create these new ones. So the newest apple from the University of Minnesota is this First Kiss apple that if you don't live in Minnesota, you've probably never heard of it, because this is the first apple that the University of Minnesota has come out with that has 2 names. First Kiss in Minnesota or Rave everywhere else. We heard about in the video that after Honeycrisp, they started trademarking the names of apples, which means there's a group of growers that are part of maybe we could call it a club, that are part of this group that decide who can sell apples under that trademark, like Sweet Tango or the Cosmic Crisp. For this one, they decided that you can only call this apple a First Kiss in Minnesota and it's Rave anywhere else. It was released in 2018. And what's special about it is that it ripens in late August. I don't know about you, but being from Florida, I thought apples would be a September, October thing. But generally around here, especially if you go to an orchard in October, all the apples are picked off the trees. They're looking for apples sooner and sooner ripening. So this one ripens in late August, just in time for the Minnesota State Fair, which is a huge deal in Minnesota. The first year that it ripened, or that it was ready in time, so it was released in 2018, they sold out in the first couple of days of the state fair of the 1,000 bushels of apples that they had ready for the fair. We got to meet this grower here that's in the picture, John from Pine Tree Orchard, who was one of the first growers of this First Kiss apple. When it was first released in 2018, he bought 3,000 trees, all the trees that were available, and started growing them. And just pointing this out, and then we'll move on here. He was worried about this high value apple that he was going to have at the state fair. He bought all the trees. What would happen if a storm came through, a hailstorm, some terrible insect infestation came through? So he invested in what you're seeing in the picture, these nets that he puts over all his First Kiss and Sweet Tango apples. He said it's kind of pricey, but those are his high dollar, high value apples. And so he wants to protect them at all costs. So this was a really interesting stop that we got to see and learn more about the First Kiss apple and how excited they were to have something to sell at the state fair that was ready at the end of August. Okay, moving on to the actual lesson and why you're all here. So the lesson that relates to all of this is called Apple Genetics. I'm going to put, Michelle, I think I can put in the chat for everyone. Nope, I cannot. I can't share a link. Okay. That's all right. If you know how to go onto the matrix on the National Ag in the Classroom website or on the Minnesota Ag in the Classroom website, you can just search Apple Genetics to take a look at the full lesson plan if you would like. So this lesson, you're going to have your students apply knowledge of heredity and genetics to distinguish between asexual and sexual reproduction and explain how new varieties of apples are developed and propagated to meet consumer demand. When we're looking at this lesson, we're going to be exploring the phenomena of taste, looking at what makes apple characteristics different. You're going to let them wonder, then explain, expand, and learn all about this. They do need to have some basic understanding of inherited traits and know that all cells, see a typo I should have fixed, of an organism have DNA. So you have to do some pre-teaching before you can use this lesson. The first part of the lesson, the engage activity, is similar to what we did at the beginning of this workshop, where they're going to try to come up with those top 10 apple varieties and talk about what apples they like, why they like them. And then we're going to try to be some apple breeders, and we're going to evaluate a couple of apples. The first activity has your students look at two apples, the Gala apple and the Braeburn, and they're going to make some observations about the similarities and differences that they can see, smell, or taste. Couple quick background pieces for you about these apples. Both of them originated in New Zealand in the 1930s or the 1950s. The Gala apple, its parent apple, is the Golden Delicious and a very New Zealand specific Kids Orange Red. It's sweet, it's crisp, it's less tart. The Braeburn apple, the parent apples, it's a little fuzzy. They maybe weren't keeping the best records in the 1950s and 60s. So the popular belief is that the Granny Smith is one of the parent apples of the Braeburn, and that's maybe where it gets its tart, sharp and refreshing flavor is how it was described. And a note that it is too old for any kind of trademark, so anybody can grow a Braeburn apple tree and then sell it. I have found varying quality of how well it tastes or the texture, depending on the time of year that I've purchased it. This is what the worksheet looks like that your students would complete comparing these two different apples. They're looking at the outside, the inside, the smell, the touch. We don't have time, and I couldn't send you apples through the camera here. So this is what you're hoping that they're going to be observing when they're looking at these two different apples. I'm not going to read all this to you, but you're welcome to look at it. You'll see some of the main differences is that tart versus sweet and the texture. If you're going to do this lesson with your students, I have a sourcing tip here. You want to call and talk to produce managers at the grocery stores near you to get a feel for when they have all these different apple varieties that we're going to use in this lesson. There's 3 of them. I have often had a hard time sourcing these apples in the summer in particular. So maybe you'll be fine in the fall, but the summer has been tricky to find them all. Once they've done this, we're going to think about, if we're an apple breeder, we're going to cross these two. We're going to think about some genetics here and how that could potentially work. And let me go to the next slide. Part of the lesson does have this PowerPoint slide. So you could go over some genetics vocabulary review that you would have already taught your students about genes, alleles, genotype, phenotype, homozygous, heterozygous, all of that would be important for them to know before you move into, we're going to do some Punnett squares where we are going to cross the Gala and the Braeburn apples to create a new one. Now, on the worksheet, and if you're looking at the full lesson plan and you're in that activity sheet, we are oversimplifying how apple genetics would work. It's not as simple as there's one set of alleles for each trait, but this is they're beginning learning about genetics. So we're going to imagine that it is as simple as this, that we can do a single gene traits for these. So you can see here, this is what we're starting. Our initial here is that tartness is recessive, sweetness is recessive. You can see what our genotypes will be for each of those for the Gala and for the Braeburn. And this is where you get to teach your students Punnett squares. And so there's a whole page for each of those traits where you can go through and do the genetic cross using the Punnett square. It would be blank. I just have the answers here for you. And you're looking at the probability of getting that genotype. Now, it would be up to you if you want to go further and have them then predict what the phenotype would be. And you'll have, this is where, okay, we're thinking single gene. So I would say the phenotype of the TT, the dominant tartness, the top two would be more tart, and then well, I need to go back and look. I'm sorry. The Braeburn, the recessive is, tartness is recessive, so I apologize. These first two would be the phenotype, they would be sweet, and our bottom one here, or not sweet, they'd just be not tart, and then our bottom recessive, this one would be tart. So that would be up to you if that works into your lesson planning to go further into what the phenotypes would look. So we've crossed them all. We're showing students that if we cross these two apple trees, there's a host of different probabilities of percentage possibilities of what we're going to get. We have the benefit of many years of apple breeding to know that the Gala and the Braeburn were crossed to create the Jazz apple. In the Q&A, I'd love to know if you've tried the Jazz apple before or if you've heard of it. So quick, have you tried it or have you heard of the Jazz apple? And so as a reminder, at this point in the lesson, your students will have looked closely at the Gala and the Braeburn apple. They will have tasted it. They can try it. They can see the difference in the texture. They can taste the difference in the tartness versus the sweetness and its smell. And then now we're going to take those two, pretend we're apple breeders, and we've crossed them, and we know we're going to get the Jazz. We've got a couple people that have tried it. Some of it have not tried it. There are so many apple varieties now. You're going to want to try Jazz one day if you see it in the store. So now at this point in the lesson, they're going to get the Jazz apple, and they're going to complete a similar worksheet as this one, but about the Jazz. And what they're going to find is that it's very clear that there are some traits from the Gala and some traits from the Braeburn apple that are found here in our Jazz apple. So it's this really visual, hands-on, easy to see that the traits from the Gala, the traits from the Braeburn, we crossed and we got this Jazz that's really kind of the best of both worlds from those two apples. And that's what I really like about this lesson for kids first learning about genetics is here's this really tangible way to see it. Here's your Jazz apple. It is also developed in New Zealand. Tangy, sweet taste, loud crunch, all the places it's grown in. And so remember, then you can go into talking about, I think what would come up next from your students, and what I've seen with students when I've done this, is then they want to know more about actually crossbreeding the apple and how long it takes. And do you see this down here? I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but the process typically takes 15 years or more. You have to cross them, then grow, then try them, then you need to grow more apple trees to be able to sell. And I think that many of our students would be surprised to learn that you're typically not just planting an apple seed. We'll go back to Honeycrest. You're not typically growing just an apple seed. It's actually a much more in-depth process once you've got that apple that you're desiring, that you're going to release as a new version. And they're doing grafting. That's how we're growing apple trees. So you take a section of the stem with the leaf buds, and then you insert it into another tree. So you can see that down here, and that allows us to skip the juvenile phase and get closer to growing quicker. The next time you're in a store and if you're in an area where you can grow apples and you see an apple tree that you could buy at the store, if you look down at the bottom of the trunk, you can often see where that tree was grafted and where it came in. So we took teachers on a tour last week, and they showed us a young apple tree, and it was very clearly visible where that tree had been grafted onto what's called the rootstock of another tree. Very interesting. Okay, any questions about this apple genetics lesson? There's a lot there for you to do. I'm actually going to stop sharing for a minute and then reshare this other screen just to make sure that we all have seen this lesson plan. So stop share and reshare this screen. Okay. So I'm on the minnesota.iclassroom.org on our curriculum matrix, which is the same if you were to access it on the National Ag in the Classroom, or if your state has it on their website. I searched apple genetics. Here's that lesson. We have the PowerPoint slides. There's the activity sheet that I had been sharing with you. You can do a lesson here on apple, how does it grow, if you want to look more at how apples are growing. Like, we haven't talked at all about if you were an apple grower, how you're growing the tree, the flowers, all of that stuff. You can see all of that in this video. And we have some more background information for you as the teacher. We keep going. Here's that engage activity, all your instructions. And then when we get down here to the bottom under elaborate, there are additional videos. And this is the one that I showed you earlier in this lesson, or in this workshop, the apple that changed the world. There are others if you don't want it to be quite as silly. I mean, they were clearly in New York City filming, pretending they were in Minnesota discovering the apple, but I think it's an entertaining video. So that's all right here, an evaluate activity where they're looking at what are the differences between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So let's see, before we move on to the quick preview of one other lesson that is, oh, it's over here, that is apple related. Just checking in the Q&A to see if there's any questions about this 6 through 8 lesson before I look at the next one. And it doesn't look like it. So I'm going to unshare and then reshare back over to my PowerPoint. Keep looking at that. All right. There is one other lesson that is targeted to high school or middle school about apples and similar genetics. It's called Apples and the Science of Selection. So if you were over on the matrix and you search apples, you'll see this one come up as a 912. We're looking here at distinguishing between natural and artificial selection. So this lesson will get into a touch on some genetic modification. Oh, here's a trivia question. Can anyone in the Q&A name the one apple variety that is a product of genetic modification, like genetic engineering? So you're going and you're changing the DNA, not just crossbreeding. There's one apple in it, makes it so it's not brown. We haven't talked about it. Any guesses? Lucy? Actually, the Arctic apple. Has anyone heard of that one? The Arctic apple? Can look that up later if you'd like to learn more about the Arctic apple. Okay, back to this lesson. I got a little off track there with trivia question. So it's for 912. It's a student-centered learning activity. So we have stations that you would set up around your room, or our friends over at the Natural Center for Ag Literacy have turned this one into more of a Google Doc that you could assign them to work on, your students to work on a laptop or at home or on a virtual day. There's a lot of flexibility with this one on how you would do it. 5 stations. Oh yes, and there is an option for e-learning, and it is linked on that lesson plan, and we'll pop over there at the end and just show you where that's at, so make sure everyone sees it. And actually, I think we'll hop on over to that lesson plan right now. And if I pull this over here, Michelle, can you give me can you see the lesson plan now instead of my
Yes.
PowerPoint, or is it? Yes, great.
Yep, you're good.
Thank you. So we'll type in here, apples. There are lots of lessons. If you've not been on the matrix before, you can go here under the advanced search, and I'm going to search high school. Go ahead and tick middle school so you can see that too. We get a few that come up. So here's that apples and the science of genetic selection. There's 5 stations, and each station has a card, which is listed here. The first station, we're going all the way back to the beginning of apples. Where did they come from? The crab apple, Johnny Appleseed, who many of us have heard. And at this station, your students would be reading about this, and there's an article for them to read all about Johnny Appleseed and really how those apples got started. They were used more for cider. So we're starting way back at the beginning of where apples came from. Then at the second station, they would get to learn about apples aren't grown from seeds. So we've got a better depiction here of grafting and what that looks like up close, and talking about that we've selectively bred them. Here is a QR code. They're going to watch that video that I just was talking about how apples grow. And at each station, they would have challenge questions on the handout. So things like, can you use grafting to create one apple tree with multiple varieties? Or could you use grafting to create one tree that has multiple varieties of fruit? Spoiler, you can. You don't see them very often, but they do exist. I've seen some citrus plants before that will have lemon lime growing on the same tree. Station 3, we're looking at applesauce and looking more closely into those popular varieties of apples. Station 4 is very intriguing about what makes apples crisp. And if you look here, it's talking about there are parts in the cell of a Honeycrisp that are larger than others. They contain large vacuoles and pockets of sugar. So when you bite into the apple, those cells burst open and release the juice from inside. Yum, that's where we get that explosively crispness in those Honeycrisp apples that are always talked about. And then here's another spot to go to a video that's about how we engineered the perfect apple. We did not watch that one. We haven't talked about it. And then finally, Station 5 is looking more closely at not crossbreeding like we've been talking about with the Gala and the Braeburn, but adding a specific trait to an apple. And so that's where that Arctic apple comes in, that has been process that was created by genetic engineering. And so we've got a couple videos here, some more articles to look at, and the Arctic apples explained, and the time lapse. So we're gonna take a quick peek at one of these here at the bottom. Of course, I
As I'm in
cannot
the
pull this up. We will mute this. Let this 4-second ad go through. I have not yet seen the Arctic apple in a store, but they do exist. I had a teacher asking me about if I'd seen them or purchased them, and I have not. If anyone else has, I'd love to know that in the Q&A if you've seen them or tried them. And this is not me saying this is the best kind of apple. It's just always good to know what all are out there. So let's do that.
Okanagan Specialty Fruits, we set out to make the perfect fruit even better. The result? Arctic apples. They're just like any other apple, but with one distinct advantage. They don't brown when they're bitten, sliced, or bruised. Why is the Arctic Advantage difference so important? A whopping 40% of apples never get eaten, in large part due to superficial browning. By delivering higher quality fruit, Arctic apples help ensure that less apples get wasted and more apples get tasted. Sounds pretty awesome, but you're probably wondering how we did it. Thanks to innovative biotechnology, we're able to silence the polyphenol oxidase, or PPO enzyme, that causes conventional apples to turn brown and yucky when they're exposed to air. Normally, when apple tissue is damaged, the cells burst open, releasing PPO and causing the browning reaction. With Arctic apples, it's easiest to think of it as simply turning off the PPO light switch to stop it from happening. We introduce apple genes to shut off the PPO genes already present in the apple. Once this tissue grows into plantlets, we graft it into rootstock. Arctic apple trees can then be planted and grown just like any other apple tree. Enzymatic browning happens when apple tissue and lots of other plant tissue, think avocado or banana, is exposed to the air and is different than browning caused by rot. Arctic apples do not hide rot and actually make it easier to tell when an apple is still good to eat. Multiple regulatory reviews have all found Arctic apples to be just as safe and healthy as any other apple. In fact, our delicious non-browning apples likely better retain their nutritional content of antioxidants and vitamin C, which are otherwise diminished by enzymatic browning. So you see, Arctic apples are just like the apple varieties that you already know and love, just cooler.
So interesting. There is a lot of science that goes into the apples that we have at the store. I would be curious to go look more and see how the Arctic apple is doing. I'm guessing not well if none of you had heard of it, and I've never seen it in the store, but it is something that's out there. So as you can see here, is we're gonna wrap up. All of that is listed here in this lesson plan, those station cards, all the links to everything, the rest of the activities. There's more background information for you. There's additional learning activities. All of that is here about apples. So we have about 2 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions, we've got about 2 minutes that we could answer a couple of questions about apples, the matrix, anything ag in the classroom.
I know we had some hands up earlier, but if they could drop their questions into the Q&A, that would be the best way for us to be able to share those out to you and see if we can get some answers going. So if you had your hand raised earlier, we may have disregarded it. But if you could drop your questions right into the Q&A, that will help us and help Carrie. And as she said, we have about 2 more minutes before we wrap up. So any of those last minute questions?
Oh, so there are some questions. Michelle, so we want them in the Q&A. I don't think we have a way to hear them.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to unmute and
gotcha. I see Carrie Milligan has a question, and that's fun to say. That used to be my maiden name. So Carrie Milligan, I'd love to know your question from Utah.
You guys can type your answers in the Q&A. That would help us. So thanks, Julie. It sounds like she's familiar with our matrix but hasn't used this lesson, so she's excited to be able to do that.
Fantastic.
Teacher wait time was never a good strength of mine.
Yeah, me neither. And when you can't see anyone.
Yes. So I think if we have no further questions, I want to thank Carrie from Minnesota Agriculture in the Classroom for presenting on exploring the orchard and apple genetics. I know I learned a lot of information being from Michigan. We're a big apple state as well. So we've got some unique varieties, and we always talk about bringing them together when we get together to be able to try all the different flavors and textures. So hopefully you enjoyed this as well. You learned a little bit about our lesson matrix, a little bit about agriculture in Minnesota. If you haven't attended National Agriculture in the Classroom before, we will be in Minnesota in June 2025. So Minnesota will be hosting us, and we're really excited for that opportunity. So please keep in touch and start planning for being in Minnesota in 2025. Our next presentation will begin at the top of the hour at 2 o'clock Eastern time. With the secondary track, we will be going into Journey 2050 with one of our staff members, Tessa Matusak. So if there's nothing else, I want to thank Carrie again for her time and her expertise on apples. And hopefully we'll see you all in Minnesota, and you can see Carrie in Minnesota as well. So thanks for your time, Carrie. And we'll start back up at 2 o'clock Eastern time. Thanks, everyone.